Do you hear me? Everything good? Okay. Maybe I will do this instead of speaking. Okay, so hello everyone on our today Backend Meetup. We will focus today on a very discussed topic. It's very discussed topic on latest conferences throughout the whole Europe and US. There was actually one conference taking place last week in San Francisco. So yeah, we want to keep up with the latest, so we will try to cover that as well. So first, maybe question: who of you have ever used GraphQL? Okay, not so many. Who have used GraphQL in production in a real world scenario? Okay, and who have used Apollo Stack for building GraphQL server? Mira, yes, our guy. Okay, so that's good. It might be for you. Hopefully, you will get something out of that, and you will find it helpful for whatever you are guys building every day. So let's proceed. What you can expect today? First, we will do some introduction for those who didn't have time to check it out yet. Then we will quickly go through GraphQL language, what constructs you can use, what is supported, and how you can query your data. And the last part will be Michal and Pavel. They will be doing live coding session where they will show you how to build actually a real GraphQL server using Apollo Stack, which is like one of the implementations of GraphQL server. Let me introduce myself. I'm Josef Zavisek. I'm working here as a backend developer. So whoever doesn't know me, you can reach me anywhere on Twitter. There will be a slide for that at the end. Okay, so let's go to important stuff. GraphQL, what is it? What is it all about? Why everything is speaking about it? Maybe we should do a step back and first talk about what is it not. GraphQL is definitely not any database. Don't perceive that as any new query language to database or whatever like this. GraphQL is also not some specific implementation. GraphQL is basically a concept introduced by Facebook. It was introduced in early 2015, and where they publicly announced what they are using internally at Facebook. But it wasn't like done, right? So community started to play with that, and many new implementations appeared. So GraphQL is basically query language for your APIs. It's basically replacement for REST APIs. And it's not only a language, but it's also server-side runtime for executing those queries. So we can divide GraphQL into two separate parts. One is the language, and one is the runtime. And there are several pieces in each of them. So we have in language, there are queries, which are meant to for querying your data from your server. Then you have mutations, so whenever you want to change something or you want to invoke some action on your server, then you can use mutations. And you have subscriptions. Subscriptions are basically for when you want to real-time listen on server changes. And there are fragments. These are like parts of GraphQL language that make GraphQL language composable, so you can like you don't have to repeat yourself. You can use those pieces and build your queries using these fragments. Runtime is like the server part. Each GraphQL server contains like validation of the hi Peter. It contains validation. So basically, whenever you shoot GraphQL query to the server, the first thing that happens is that it's parsed and then it's validated. So yeah, and what is used for that? GraphQL uses strong type systems. So basically, when you are building GraphQL server, you have to define what your server capabilities are. What you are like describing types. You will see later when Michal and Pavel will show you how to basically describe your server, what capabilities it have, what you can get from that. Interesting part is introspection. Basically, you can ask your server what his capabilities are. So you can ask for schema for those types that you defined. And the last thing is execution. So it's the main part where you execute your queries and do the business logic. Okay, so it's meant to be a replacement for REST API. It's important to note that it's protocol and language independent. You can build GraphQL using HTTP. It can be built on top of WebSockets, whatever transfer protocol you would like. It's also language independent. There are implementations built in for Ruby, for Node.js. So whatever guys you are using, you can definitely maybe on some languages it's already done some implementation in your language. So let's look how the whole thing works. So imagine that you have a client and you have a GraphQL server. So the first thing, you create a GraphQL document and you send it to server, which does several things. As I told you, it can be HTTP sockets. You can even execute your GraphQL queries in command line interface. It's totally doable. So on GraphQL, there is a schema. So when the document comes to server, the first server parses that document into abstract syntax tree and validates that query against the schema you've defined. Then it's calling so-called resolver functions, which basically ask data sources to retrieve data. And for each node in that tree, in that abstract tree, and you can use whatever data source you want. You can like ask Mongo, you can ask Postgre, you can even build a GraphQL server on top of existing REST API. So if you have existing REST API and you want to provide GraphQL interface for that, it's totally feasible. And when the data comes back to the server, server does merging into one single object, and this object is passed back to the client in single response. So for those who didn't have time to check it out yet, it looks something like this. This can be like hello world query in GraphQL. So you can see that basically it looks like JSON, and that's how it was meant to be, because then when a response comes, it exactly matches the shape of data that you queried. This part is called, they are calling it selection sets. And these are like fields. You can have something more sophisticated, not so more, but at least a little. You can have complex field, and you can guess what a response would look like. It would have the same shape as the request was, as the request has had. So, but what was the initial motivation to build something like that, right? REST is cool. Why we should use something different than REST? And they have at Facebook. It appeared when they were solving troubles with iOS newsfeed, because there were like many unrelated data, and they have to do several round trips to the server. And when you imagine that Facebook has like users all over the world where the network isn't really good, you want to minimize like round trips to the server. So the basic idea is how it works in a REST API is usually this, right? You send requests to get some resource and server response, and then okay, I need for that book, I need author to display it together. Then I need another author for another book, and it can end up with bombarding your server with requests. and that's something we don't like. You can suggest that we can easily solve that with some, let's say, query parameter. But when you would like to get another nested object from author, it's hard to construct this or model this thing in classical REST API endpoints. So GraphQL can like smoothly follow relations between objects and can retrieve even nested data. So the solution is easy. Basically, you define that the GraphQL query, you send all the requirements to the server, and then server responds with data, and you have like one round trip for, let's say for one page, you would have like one trip, because you can request many data in single round trip. Another thing that they were solving was like REST API endpoints are often returning data that you don't really need, right? So imagine that you would have something like this. Let's stick with books. And let's say we have some very, very hard to compute field there, but usually REST API endpoints are built in the way that you send those data even though client might not need them. And it might be really hard to compute on server and you are losing some like efficiency, right? So in GraphQL, you will always get only those fields that you request, nothing more, nothing less. So whenever there is like this complex object, you really have to specify the fields that you are requesting. There is nothing like wildcard sign that you would say, oh, give me all author fields. Client always have to specify what those fields will be. Does it make sense so far? Cool. Another thing is that, and it often happens to me as well, I don't know who of you are backend developers, but we have this situation here, like I built an endpoint with the detail of author, where I put like some fields, right? And then I built another endpoint for retrieving books, but sometimes fields in detail of author doesn't perfectly match like author object in like list of books. And that's because front-end guys come to us and say, hey, why didn't you include that field into that response? Because we want this author to have exactly the same shape as it had here. But the problem is that we are telling them, okay, but this field is hard to compute. I don't want to do some joins only because you want to have the shape the same. And that's another thing that GraphQL solves pretty smoothly. Since clients really have to define what fields they actually need, you can only resolve, you can only call resolver functions on those nodes that you will be returning from the server. Okay, that was a quick intro into the technology. And let's look on GraphQL language. We will use something called Graphical, which is a tool built by Facebook, and it's very easy to integrate it into your GraphQL server. It's usually like built in GraphQL libraries already. And I found this image somewhere on the internet, so not sure what the guy was requesting, but hopefully it will be enough for like see what it can do. You can see that you have built-in documentation, so when you are building a type system of your server, you can include there descriptions of those fields, and those descriptions will automatically appear here on the right side in docs panel. You can see that Graphical can do autocomplete. How it works is basically it uses introspection. It calls server, hey, give me what schema, what data you provide, what are your capabilities, and it can like provide this autocomplete for you. So we will look, I will try to code something, not only talk. We will go and see how queries works, what you can use in queries. So you can use variables, you can pass parameters to your queries. Then you can use aliases when you want to rename some of your fields, you can do that. That's also cool. We will look at fragments, inline fragments, and mutations. So I'll switch to one page. It is called GraphQL Hub. Basically, there are like some public APIs already built with GraphQL, like GitHub announced that their API will be powered by GraphQL. So, and this GraphQL Hub allows you to query those public APIs, so I'll use that for a demonstration. Yesterday it didn't work pretty well, but hopefully today it's okay, so hopefully it will be okay. So I'll switch to this. You can find here like what APIs you can like try and play with. So I'll use GitHub because we all know, all of us know GitHub, right? I'll delete that so we can see like we can go from scratch, and I'll go through basic constructs. So first of all, let's do queries. When I hit control space, you can see it's telling me what I can use here. Basically, I have these 5 options. If you use just this, it's query. So, but I will use query so to make it more clear. And I can start writing it like this, but it's always good to name the query. So I'll say, okay, get repo. Repo like this. Because you can then easily track what your queries were, so it's fine to name everything. I can even include multiple queries here, but then I will have to specify what query I want server to execute. So I'll just include one. And as I told you, I will use GitHub API, and they provide these 2 root nodes. So I'll ask for, let's say, repo. Since repo is complex type, I have to define what fields I'm asking for. So what I will select ID, I'll select, let's say, name, and whatever. Okay, that's enough. You can see that it's telling me that I have something wrong here. And on what you can do on server side, you can specify that you are requesting, there are some arguments that client has to pass to the query. So I'll include those arguments, and you can say these are required. These are not optional, so client really needs to send those queries, those arguments. If I wouldn't do that, it will send the query, but it will immediately tell me, okay, something's wrong. Hey, give me some arguments there. So I'll put there something since we are. So let's find this repo, and I have to specify owner username. Okay, so and it's GraphQL, and I can execute a query, and it's giving me some data. What I wanted to show you. Since you don't know what it can be here, like you can search it in docs. So since I'm using GitHub API, it's telling me, okay, when you want to request repository, please include name and its string and it's required. This exclamation mark means it's required argument. So these 2 arguments are required, and it will give me GitHub repository, which can have these fields. So that's documentation. This is something called arguments, obviously. Another thing that I can include, I can pass the name through I can make a variable from this. Okay, maybe I will copy that so I don't have to write it. So let's say repo name, and I will specify variable here, so, and it will be string and it will be required. And then I have to define variable here, and I'll put there what I have in clipboard. So I'll try that, still working. So yeah, variables are defined here in JSON object, and they are automatically mapped to, each variable has to have this $sign prefix. So that were variables. Then what we can, there is another feature of GraphQL language which is called directives. So imagine that we have we want to see commits, okay? So, and for example, message. So it's giving me some messages of commits. I can even say like limit to 10 because it there is like optional argument limit. But maybe one thing, imagine that you would like to retrieve 2 users. Let's say user, I will say, okay, Lee Byron, which is, by the way, creator of GraphQL, and he like was at the beginning of the whole thing. And what I would like to see is his ID and his login. Okay, so let's retrieve that, and you can see here is Lee Byron. But for example, I would like to retrieve another user. I will use Polacek Pavel, which is the guy next to me, our backend developer. And you can see that, okay, what should be like the key of those two, because we have user already here, right? So you can use aliases. So I can say, okay, Lee is this guy, and Pavel is this guy. So let's put it there, ID and login. And GraphQL can like automatically rename those fields for me. I can just use alias feature, which is like this part. Then there is important part called fragments. So you already saw that I'm repeating myself. I'm specifying those fields again and again. So I can use fragments for this case. So I can specify user info on, and now I don't know what. So I'll go to documentation, and I can see that user is returning GitHub user. So I can specify fragment on GitHub user. So let's do that on GitHub user, and I can specify ID, login. By the way, commas and these things are optional. You can put it there. You don't have to. So let's put login here, and I can substitute this. I can use something like spread operator here, so I can reuse this fragment here, so I don't have to repeat myself. So I execute it, and it's still working. Is it clear? Cool. Hi, Peter. So another thing are something called inline fragments. Maybe I will cover it a little later. I will cover something called directives. So basically, you can say, I want to include this thing only if I'll put true there. But you can imagine that I can pass there some variable and like parameter. Okay, I'll do that to make it like more clear. So include commits and boolean. It will be required. It's telling me that I'm not using anywhere the variables, so I will put it right here. And I'll have to specify that variable here. So let's put there true. Still working. When I put a false, then it will not include any. You could see that there is another directive called skipped, which is the opposite, right? So Another part of the language is something called inline fragments, and the use case can be, for example, author of the commit. When you look at the documentation, you can see that repository has commits, and commit has author, which is user or commit author. So it's something called union type, and it can be a handful. Sometimes you can specify on server that like at this place, at this node, there can be like two types of data, two shapes. So when you want to request one or the other, you say basically, okay, from on GitHub user, give me like his login, but if it's not registered user, you can say give me his email only. Like you can see that it doesn't allow me to write login here because it doesn't know if it's on GitHub user or here or where, because GitHub commit does not have login here. I can only specify these two things. So that's basically it. I'll return to my presentation. And the last thing I want to show and cover are how mutations can look like. I'll not code it, but you'll get a feeling. You can pass some parameters to server action, and after the action is executed on the server, you can select what data you want to retrieve back. So you can imagine in REST API it would be like post to server, post can give me some data after the post was done. So this is something similar, or like you are executing some action, and after that action you are defining this selection set, what you want to retrieve after the action is done. So I would recommend you some resources to study more about GraphQL. I think great talk is by creator of GraphQL, Lee Byron. I'll share the presentation somewhere so you don't have to write it. I think official docs are pretty great because they included a graphical tool directly into their documentation, so that you can play with that even on their website. There is nice course on how to start with GraphQL. If you have subscription to Plural site, I really recommend you recommend you going through that. And the last but not least, definitely, there was this conference I mentioned. It was in San Francisco like 2 weeks ago, and they officially made videos from that conference public, so you can watch it. It will be pretty interesting stuff, I guess. So yeah, I will pass it over to. Okay, maybe I'll. Do you have questions? I think. But I think it will be more clear when guys will start coding. They will show you Apollo stack, which is, I believe, one of the greatest implementation of GraphQL server available. Like Facebook did some referential implementation. You can find it as GraphQL in Node Package Manager, but we are using Apollo stack, which is built by Meteor guys, and guys will show you how it looks like, and they will code something real, so you get a feeling. Thank you. That's my Twitter, by the way. Not so important, but yeah. So guys, welcome to.